So again, good afternoon and welcome to this public webinar. My name is François Dejean. I'm the head of the Secretariat to the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. This is a public webinar and we will be streaming it on the Advisory Board's website, and the webinar will also be recorded to be made available afterwards. In a moment, I will hand over the floor to the chair of the Advisory Board, Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, who will present the main recommendations from the 2040 Advisory Board. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session facilitated by my colleague Erasmus Sangild. You will have the opportunity to ask questions to the chair about the report and its conclusions. During this Q&A session, we will only take oral questions instead of written ones. So you will be asked to raise your virtual hand, and we will address the questions in the order the hands are raised. So we will focus only on questions asked verbally. Please therefore refrain from using the chat for submitting questions. Each person will be allowed to ask up to 2 questions, and we would kindly request that you ask both questions before the chair provides the answers. Once the floor is given to you, please introduce yourself, state your organization that you're from, and if that is the case. Please note that we will have to conclude the meeting at 3 p.m. sharp. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Edenhofer, the chair of the Advisory Board, to take the floor while we are sharing the slides.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, François. I hope you can hear me and you can see me and you can see also the slides.
Yes, we can hear you very well, and I assume that participants can see the slides as well.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. So I intend to present our advice on the use very quickly our advisory board. Let me highlight that we are an independent body providing the EU with scientific knowledge, expertise, and advice relating to climate change. We evaluate policies, we identify action opportunities to successfully achieve US climate targets. We have been established in 2021 by the European Climate Law and consists of 15 independent senior scientists, experts covering a broad range of relevant disciplines from economics to engineering to natural science. That's a good starting point, and it was a great privilege, let me highlight this, to work together with these wonderful colleagues. Now, let me start to explain what we have done. So EU 2040 target is needed for a gradual reduction of emissions. In order to kick off an irreversible transition, the EU target should be based on the best available science. Within the 6th month of the first global stocktake, the Commission will propose a 2040 target considering the latest reports of the advisory board. And we basically provided that. And the Commission will, based on this, publish the projected indicative greenhouse gas budget for 2030 to 2050, taking into account the advice of the board. Now, let me highlight an important aspect. Providing a global carbon budget, this is nothing which can be only based on natural science. You have to take into account, the next slide, please. You have to take into account value judgments. And so there's value judgments and facts are intertwined. And the only way how to deal with this is to be explicit about the underlying value judgments. This is what we have done in our report. We want to be explicit about the legal context where we're operating, then the understanding the limits of the emissions, the global carbon budget in the context of the greenhouse gas emissions. And we take into account also value judgments about the fair share of the EU's emissions. We quantified the pathways to climate neutrality. We used up-to-date scenarios, and within the scenarios, we make sure that different perspectives are represented. And we filtered the scenarios according to feasibility, resilience, side effects, and co-benefits. And the value judgments are not our own value judgments. We are guided by the EU values and communicated these values transparently. And also we intend to make explicit the implications of the targets the EU has already decided. Now let me come to our first recommendation. So the advisory board recommends keeping the EU's greenhouse gas emission budget within a limit of 11 to 14 gigatons CO2 between 2030 and 2050. Staying within this budget requires an emission reduction of 90 to 95% by 2040 relative to the 1990 level. This range considers multiple dimensions of fairness and feasibility of the emission reduction. The target and the budget figure in the headlines refer to net domestic greenhouse gas emissions, including the emissions from intra-EU aviation and maritime transport. So to derive this recommendation, the board identified the latest available scientific evidence on scenario pathways for achieving climate neutrality, and it also considers what constitutes a fair share to global climate action. Now, how we organize the process. First, we identified and processed the scenarios, and we excluded at the first step the scenarios which did not contain sufficient data at the EU 27 level. We also excluded scenarios which were not consistent with the existing EU greenhouse gas objectives. And also we excluded scenarios which assumed highly implausible deployment in the short run. So this was the first layer of selection. The second one is we filtered out scenarios with high feasibility concerns. For example, when scenarios assumed a larger primary biomass than 20 exajoule, or technological feasibility concerns when carbon capture, utilization, and storage has been assumed by larger than 500 megatons CO2 in 2050, or a deployment of hydrogen above a level of 150 gigawatts in 2030. So we take into account also socio-cultural feasibility concerns. So when final energy demand has to be or should be declined according to the scenarios larger than 20% between 2020 and 2030, we also filtered these scenarios. So based on this limited scenarios, so in the end, 5 to 7 scenarios survived. We did a comparative feasibility analysis. And in particular, we have taken into account the environmental risks and technological challenges. So the environmental risks refer to the reliance on carbon capture and utilization and storage, carbon removals from land and bioenergy, and the technological risks can be characterized by the rate of deployment of solar photovoltaics, wind, and hydrogen. So the next slide, please. So the 7 scenarios with limited risk associated with respect to carbon capture and utilization and storage, bioenergy deployment in the size of links. And you see basically here the one in red, which basically highlight significant environmental and technological risk. And then the green ones are the one which are in that reasonable range. So based on this feasibility study, so then we come up with a range for the carbon budget, but also not only for the carbon budget, but also for the reduction target. So the next slide, please. And here we have taken into account the environmental risk level, less reliance on carbon capture, utilization and storage, carbon removals from land and bioenergy. So then we come up with a range between 11 to 16 gigatons CO2, or the 88 to 95% reduction. And then we have taken into account not only the environmental risk, but also the technological deployment. So the 5 scenarios remained, and then we had basically a range between 13 to 16 gigatons CO2 equivalents, and then a reduction range between 88 to 92%. It is worthwhile to highlight here that these scenarios do not only take into account this environmental risk. Most of the scenarios are also cost-effective reduction pathways, because it is important that when we want to achieve in 2050 100% on net zero, so then it is cost-effective in this range, which also respects the environmental and the technological deployment risks. As the next step, we basically have taken into account value judgments. And of course, when it comes to the fair share, justice issues are now on the table. And there is no way for scientists to come up with one justice consideration. So what we can do is we can be explicit about a multitude of justice principles. And we have taken into account a few of them. So we started with grandfathering, the immediate per capita convergence, and also end up with and cost optimal. This might be ethical principles, but grandfathering is not consistent with equity, and the cost effective and the cost optimal pathway or distribution of labor across the globe is very much dependent on effectiveness and efficiency issues, and not so much on equity. So then we remained with the other criteria. So from immediate per capita convergence to the greenhouse development rights. And you see basically this broad range of options here. A positive remaining carbon budget, and also in some cases a negative budget. So if we take into account this feasibility issue in our consideration, so we end up to say that in order to close the gap between the feasibility and the fair share, additional then this ends up, so to say, with a minimum ambition informed by the fair share, which is at least 90%, and also so achieving the more ambitious end of this energy range implied challenging levels of energy technology to scale up 95%. And therefore, we ended up so with this range between 90 to 95% reduction, and the remaining budget between 11 to 40 gigatons CO2 equivalents. So if you look at the pathway, you can see here very clearly that this pathway leads us into the 2050 to the target. We have in 2040 the range between 90 to 95%, and also so the at least the 55% is consistent with this range. So this is what we have done so far, and this brings me now to our second recommendation. Pursuing the more ambitious end of the 2040 target range improves the fairness of the EU's contribution. Ambitious domestic emission reductions need to be complemented by measures outside the EU to achieve a fair contribution to climate change. And in order to show the whole picture, and so to a certain extent, the next slide condense what we have basically explored in our report. So on the right-hand side, you see the range of the US fair share. So ranging from the highest equal per capita to the lowest ability to pay range. So this is the fair share. So and we intend to be very precise here, because we want to separate on the one hand the ethical issue of the fair share from the feasibility issue, and not to mix both of them. So if we come to the feasibility issue, so then you can see basically we have the highest possible ambition for the 90% reduction and for the 95% reduction. And even if we would go for the 95, there remain a significant gap between the fair share and the feasibility, the feasible reduction pathway. And there are two ways, or three additional amendments which should be taken into account. First of all, so pre-2050, we need ambitious domestic emission reduction. So you can see this on the left-hand side. Even this ambitious emission reduction include significant carbon removals. We need post-2050, and this is the third arrow, we need post-2050 net negative emissions within the EU in order to close the gap between the fair share and the feasibility. And in addition to that, we need mitigation action outside the EU. Within the report, we haven't explored precisely what kind of options are available for mitigation outside the EU. We haven't been explicit about the potential for additional cooperation. We just highlighted. So this is one option in addition to the CDR option to close that gap. Now this brings me now to the third insight. The EU 2030 target of at least 55% reduction compared to 1990 enables reaching the recommended 2040 target range in climate neutrality by 2050. So the next slide, please. So that's basically the recommended 2040 target that can be realized within this frame. However, we also highlighted that additional short-term emission reduction would further decrease the EU's cumulative emissions until 2050 and thus increase the fairness of the EU's contribution to global mitigation. It is also important to understand that emission reduction in the current decade are very important and decisive. So this brings me to my next recommendation, the fourth one. The recommended 2040 target requires rapid, inclusive, and well-managed transition to address environmental risks and technological scale-up. Next slide, please. And here, it's also important to understand that there are risks for technological deployment. There are challenges linked to the scale-up of solar photovoltaic, wind, and hydrogen production. And these challenges has to be addressed by a decisive climate policy. It is worthwhile to highlight here that compared to the REPowerEU scenarios, the scenarios we assessed tend to have a larger deployment of solar photovoltaics and lower deployment of wind. So, and also we come up with a target for hydrogen around 5 gigawatts here. So the next slide, please. This is the fifth recommendation. Achieving climate neutrality within the EU is to be supported through investments in innovation and wider capacity deployment. So investing in technology and social governance, innovation, and wider capacity can expand the range, of course, of feasible mitigation outcomes. And the board recommends taking a deliberate adaptive approach to harness and to accelerate the dynamics of the energy transition. So next slide, the economic and social implication depend largely on the implementation. So the transition has to be managed in a reasonable way. We have to take into account the local context. We should engage stakeholders and we should ensure equity and justice. Investments in innovation and wider capacity deployment can expand the range of feasible mitigation outcome. It might allow further emission reduction and also reduces the need for carbon removals. But arguing for reducing the need of carbon removals does not imply that we can sacrifice carbon removals. We need them. An adaptive approach will harness and accelerate the dynamics of the transition. And also there are numerous potential benefits, from a better air quality to less dependence on imported fossil fuels and less water stress. And inequality and justice implications must be addressed. Economic, social, and costs, so the side effects, benefit from some demand side action, because then I will highlight this in a minute. This will help us also to achieve or to be consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. So the next recommendation, the sixth one, is the required transition can be achieved by distinct combinations of demand management and technological deployment, compared to pathways that prioritize supply side technological solutions. Pathways with lower energy and natural resource use have some advantages. It helps to progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. It can enhance the energy security and lower other technological and environmental risks. Now, let me highlight that we have selected 3 iconic pathways in order to underpin and to explore quite explicitly what are pathways which can be characterized a little bit more in detail and can be underpinned by the social, technological feasibility. So we analyzed 3 iconic pathways. The first one is the high renewable energy. Would like to highlight here that is the high renewable pathway. So then the demand side in the mixed auction pathway, and these 3 iconic pathways have distinct characterizations. So the scenario which has a demand side focus relies on less resource intensive lifestyles, lowest final energy demand in 2040 compared to the other scenarios, and the lowest reliance on carbon removals from CCS and the land sink combined by 2050. So then we have a second pathway, which we call the high renewable energy pathway. It has the largest greenhouse gas budget compared to the others. It has high renewable energy deployment, the highest deployment of non-biomass renewable energy, and also the highest rate of electrification by 2040. We analyzed also a third pathway, which we call the mixed auction pathway. It has the lowest cumulative emissions in the 2030-2050 period. It has the greatest deployment of carbon removals with a very specific focus on sustainable land-based removals. And also it has a relatively high share of nuclear power and even an increase over time. So these are the 3 iconic pathways which we find here in our scenarios, in order to show that this is not just one way to achieve the goals, but there are many pathways to do this, at least 3 ones, which can be also then selected by the decision makers. I also have several times that there are potential synergies and trade-offs if you look at this different pathways. And the next slide, please. And here we analyzed this 3 parts. So next slide, please. So we analyzed the potential synergies and trade-offs for all the 3 pathways, according to the social, the environmental SDGs, and the economic SDGs. And by and large, just to say some rough characterization, the demand side focus has a lot of side benefits when it comes to the demand side measures. Even the high renewable pathways also brings a lot of additional benefits. And if we go to the supply side, there are some risk categories, but still, so to say, the demand side scenario and the high renewable pathway exhibits significant side benefits and co-benefits with social, environmental, and economic SDGs. So, Francois, I'm a little bit. So, is it possible to go to the next slide, please? Because I'm stuck with slide 22.
I can say it goes for all in the room that we are stuck on slide 22.
Okay. Okay. So then probably you might find out, so to say, to go to the next slide. But anyway, I'm very close to the end. So let me highlight recommendation 7. There are different pathways to achieve climate neutrality, a decisive choice between various policy options, and therefore have to be made. Common features shown in the assessed scenarios could helpfully guide further policy deployment. So nevertheless, these scenarios basically show some common characteristic. First of all the scenarios show a strong decarbonization of the power sector. The share of electricity in final energy demand doubles. 70 to 90% wind, solar, and hydrogen deployment. Coal is almost phased out by 2030. Natural gas by 2040. The scale up of bioenergy and hydrogen will rise between the scenarios, but still there is scale up. The reduction of total energy demand by 20 to 40% compared to today, with significant reductions in transport industry, residential, and the tertiary sector. The reduction of non-CO2 emissions by 20 to 60% compared to today, with a significant reduction in agriculture, energy, and the waste sector. And this should be emphasized, scale up of carbon removals estimated to represent between 146 to 614 megatons CO2 in 2040. So then also we thought about the scale up of Lansing's bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture, and storage. So let me conclude here. And unfortunately, so it seems that it's not possible to transmit the slides, but nevertheless, I hope I can convey the key findings and the key recommendations. Greenhouse gas emissions budget within 11 to 14 gigatons CO2 equivalents between 2030 and 50. Emission reduction in the range of 90 to 95% relative to 1990. So we have taken into account environmental risk and the technology scale-up challenges, and this and also include cost-effective and cost-efficient considerations in the scenarios. So improving the fairness of the EU's contribution by pursuing more demand and measures outside the EU and net negative emissions after 2050. So the EU's 2030 target enables reaching the recommended 2040 target. Support is needed. Investments in innovation and capacity deployment is required. Pathways with lower energy and natural resource use advance progresses towards the SDGs. They can improve energy security and lower other risks compared to pathways which might prioritize exclusively the supply side technology. And common features shown in the assessed scenarios could helpfully guide further policy development in order to identify robust scenarios. So this is by and large what we have done in our report. And now I look forward to your questions, and I think we can now stop sharing the slide. And so I can tell you, you have only missed one slide, one figure, and this is something which you can easily find then in the report. So far, thanks a lot, and now I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Edenhofer, and my apologies for this little technical glitch. As Professor Edenhofer mentioned, you only missed one slide, and you will find it easily in the information in the report and in the summary. Now for the questions, I will shortly hand over to my colleague Rasmus Sangild, who will facilitate this Q&A session. As I indicated earlier, we will only take verbal questions, so please raise your virtual hand and we will address the questions in the order the hands are raised. Rasmus, can you then go for the first questions? Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. We have several questions. The first one is from Alex von Both.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Edenhofer, for the presentation. I had a look at the data and just wanted to ask the remaining 36 scenarios that you published. Are they all mostly from the Remind models, or like what is the distribution among the models there? And then as a second follow-up question, would it be possible to get access to the exact scenarios? Like just to like, could I use the portal on YASA for that, or is there like some other resources that we could access for that? Thanks a lot.
Excuse me, but we cannot hear you, unfortunately.
You are muted, Otmar. Sorry.
I apologize so that I'm muted. So the 36 scenarios came from 4 models. So Remind plays an important role, but there are other models included, and so that's not an equal distribution among models. And the scenarios are available from the YASA's Scenario Explorer, and of course you have then access to that Explorer.
Thank you. And the next question is from Wendell Trio.
Yes, hello. This is Wendell Trio. I work for several organizations, including Airclim in Sweden. I mean, this is a great report. I have a question about what you, Professor, said in the beginning about the value judgments. And so there's a number of political choices being made in this report. One is, I mean, about the final recommendations. You identify in the report, there's 2 ways of coming to a carbon budget. One is the top-down approach with the physical carbon budget from the IPCC, and then kind of having an ethical approach with regard to fair share distribution. And the second one is looking at the feasibility of existing scenarios. And the final recommendation in the end comes out of the feasible scenarios, and you push a little bit to make them closer to the top-down approach, but they don't match, and that's where you suggest that there might be other forms of cooperation. So my question is, why have you chosen actually not to also come up with recommendations based purely on physical science and equity? Because that's how the Paris Agreement was made. I mean, there's a target to try to reach 1.5, and then governments made the recommendation to the IPCC, let's now have a number of scenarios developed that show how we can reach this 1.5. You don't make that kind of recommendation for new model scenarios to be developed that will actually match the equity approach, well, one of the equity approaches, let's say. Linked to that, and that's my second question, in the background report made by Pels et al., they are looking at least 2 pathways, what they call stylistic pathways. One of them being a pathway with a minus 65% emission reduction in 2030 and reaching net zero by 2040, which basically is the pathway that many European NGOs have been pushing for. And they showed that that pathway would actually meet at least the most minimalist equity division of the existing, or of the remaining carbon budget. nevertheless, in your recommendations, you kind of do not refer to any need for a revision of the 2030 target or a need of a revision of the 2050 net zero target. Why is that? Why did you not incorporate that part of this report in your final report? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is a very valuable question. So let me highlight that the first one is we thought it is very important to separate the fair share from the feasibility. And by the way, the IPCC in the RS6 also highlighted 6 dimensions of feasibility. And there is also a very important understanding here that basically there is no moral obligation without feasibility, and therefore we explored, so to say, the feasibility and compare this with the fair share. And I think this is what we can do, because in the end we are not in a position just to say there's one ethical principle of the fair share which could be applied. So there's a range between the equal per capita to the green development rights. There's a huge distributional concerns are involved, and we felt that as a board we are not in a position to come up with just one recommendation here. So that's important, and of course we hope that this clear distinction between feasibility and the value judgment facilitate a public debate, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the globe, that to see that what is here the gap. So in that sense, we acknowledge that there is we are living in a multi-universe of value judgments, not just one. And it is also not the case that the IPCC basically had one top-down approach with one ethical principle. This is and obviously all these fair shares can now be used also to come up with a way how to facilitate then climate policy. So that was our this was our decision, and basically we followed here the 6 feasibility dimensions, or at least the feasibility approach of the IPCC. So the 2030 issue. So that's also an important aspect, and thanks for that question, because this allows me to elaborate here a little bit. Most of the scenarios we have analyzed have not taken into account the short-term inertia. And for us, it was important not just to justify short-term inertia, this was not our intent, but just to show if we take into account the short-term inertia and the inertia to change the capital stock, so how does this, what are the implications for a 55 target allows us to move to the 2040 targets, which we highlighted between 90 to 95% in carbon neutrality by 2050. And our report makes also clear that overachieving the 2030 target could contribute to the global fairness. But this does not imply that basically implies not the reopening of the whole Green Deal. So this is a fine line, and we have to be very nuanced and very precise what we have done. But then the motivation was, when we take into account the short-term inertia, which has not been taken into account by most of the scenarios, so then what are the implications? And then the implication is that the minimum 55% reduction then basically can lead us to the long-term target.
Thanks, and we have quite a few on the list now, so maybe if you can kindly keep your questions short, then we will have time for more questions. Next person on my list is Richard Andresen.
Good afternoon. Yes, thank you very much for this presentation and exceptional and important analysis. My name is Finner. I'm the chair of the Icelandic Young Environmentalists Association and youth delegate to the UNFCCC. I have a question about the sort of wider implications of this analysis. So of course the EU's actions are critical, but I'm curious if there are any plans to make similar pathway analysis for other regions of the world, or collaborate with other similar advisory bodies to figure out what pathways are needed for other major emitters to stay within the 1.5 degree limit. Of course, also based on these principles of justice and equity, which have to harmonize between the different regions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So we will not carry out analysis because this is not in our mandate, but definitely. So we encourage, or we hope that our report encourages that other national boards, but in particular also other boards around the globe, will carry out such an analysis, because this would be extremely helpful for the future COPs to do this. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Next person is Chiara Corradi.
Good afternoon. I'm Chiara Corradi from Transport and Environment, and I am in Brussels. Thank you very much for this opportunity for this webinar. So my first question concerned bioenergy. So the board seems to identify a safety threshold connected with bioenergy deployment, and still biofuel are identified as solutions in aviation, shipping and industry when electrification is not possible. My question would be, to what extent is the non-scalability of the production of truly sustainable biofuels has been accounted for, and to what extent the competition for scarce resources by the different sectors has been accounted for? My second question concerned the emissions from international aviation and shipping. So the target identified by the board doesn't include these emissions. It's well explained why. This is the approach that the European Commission has adopted so far. And the board specified that the exclusion of this emission is not its recommendation, and also provides a 2040 target when with the inclusion of emission from international aviation and shipping. This target is about 89% of emission reduction by 2040. The board also says that the extent to which these emissions are included in the target depends on whether these sectors are regulated by EU law. Now, my understanding is that the European Union is in fact taking responsibility for the emissions from international aviation and shipping, with the foreseen review of ETS in 2024 and 26 in relation to the emission of maritime sector and aviation. The EU is taking responsibility with this, with now Refuel EU and Fuel EU Maritime. My conclusion would be that, in fact, since the EU is taking responsibility for that, it's kind of time to include the emission of aviation and shipping in the targets. And my conclusion would be then that the 2040 target to be recommended is in fact 88 and 89%. Could you have a comment on these, or is my interpretation correct? Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me start with the with your question on the biofuels. So the biofuels in transport vary significantly between the scenarios, and some scenarios have very low levels of biofuels, others have higher. So it is always a problem. So then to highlight all this, based on the granularity of the scenarios at this level. So the scenarios are built on underlying economic and social scenarios that include high levels of biofuels, also include sufficient levels for food supply. So in that sense, some of the synergies are taken into account, of course, but that is something which needs much more a detailed analysis, which we haven't done. But roughly speaking, and by and large, the synergies and trade-offs are taken into account in most of the scenarios to a larger and a lower degree. So we make also clear that electrification and the modest resource use lowers this risk. So this is clear. And but nevertheless, there are some in some scenarios, bioenergy plays an important role, in particular when it comes to negative emissions, because in the negative emissions scenarios, BECCS, so the combination of bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage plays an important role. So the newest technologies like direct air capture is of limited relevance in the current scenarios. But I think this is a kind of an update which is needed over time. Regarding the international transport, so we don't make assumptions on the outcome of the review of the scope of regulated emissions from aviation. So that's important. In principle, and this is, you can find this in our table, in principle, we would include them in our result, but for our exercise of comparing fairness, feasibility, it would be preferable to consider inter-EU flights and shipping and address the change in scope in a separate table. But so the implications about the scope of regulation, so we provided here a table which basically explains then the implication for the targets. I think that's roughly, yeah, so this would be my answer to your second question.
Thank you. And next up is Spinaci Gianluca.
Thank you, Rasmus. Good afternoon, everybody on the call. My name is Gianluca Spinaci. I work as a Green Deal advisor in Brussels in the European Committee of the Regions, which is a treaty-based institution assembling mayors and presidents of regions of all the 27 member states. Before I ask the two questions, let me say the level of appreciation for this one-year work, both in the Scientific Advisory Board and in the Secretariat. We have seen this institution being asked, and we have fought together with the European Parliament to have it in the climate law. And it's very reassuring to see in 1 year what you achieved in terms of already a major report. But I don't also underestimate the administrative, let's say, effort to set up an institution. Let me say how, at least for our small institution of mayors and presidents of regions, we are supportive of this, and we are ready to cooperate in the months to come. The first question indeed is related to this, because many of the findings of this report are relevant for policymakers at all levels. And we know how sometimes mayors and presidents of regions are so forward-looking and also supportive of progressive policy on this. So do you have a strategy in the months to come to reach out to these different levels of government, and how do you see an added value of engaging also with the subnational level? The second question is related to a news of today. So France, together with other 4 member states, officially asked the Environment Council of Ministers today to table a point related to giving Europe a quantified trajectory for warming scenarios. France itself has given a scenario of warming between 3 and 4 degrees by the end of the century. And the question is the following: to which extent do you think that your Scientific Advisory Board could work also on scientific advice of quantified scenarios for warming and climate adaptation to this warming, given the fact that we will have to work on both mitigation and adaptation? So do you have plans to work on quantified scenarios and policy, let's say, advice on climate adaptation and resilience? These are the two questions.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And first of all, thanks also for your words of appreciation. Now, the first question is regarding to the communication with the subnational level. Of course, so we will we will have this webinars, but our main focus is now indeed on the European Parliament and also on the Commission and also the Council. I think that's clear. But we aim to reach out also to the national level, because we are working very closely to our national climate councils. So we had already meeting with them, and so of course we hope that they will also capitalize from our work. Now the last question is about adaptation and mitigation, and this is something which highlights the importance of the work program for 2024, because this year we will have another report on CDR and on policy consistency. And now we are in the deliberation process. What would be the work program for 2024? And so what you mentioned here is adaptation is definitely a very good candidate. But one thing I would like to highlight here is, and this is something which is important to understand. We as a board, as the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, we do not carry out own research. So we are an assessment body and body of evaluation. So what we can do is we can work together with research institutes, and we can also basically nudge a little bit the research agenda. But in the end, what we have to do and what we can do is evaluating existing research. And in that sense, we think about adaptation. We evaluate what the scientific community is doing, but let's see how far we can go here, based on the research which can be provided. Yeah. So and I would like to highlight here that the responsibility, our responsibility, so the point of reference for us is the EU climate law, and therefore, so our starting point is the advice to the EU stipulated in the European climate law, and we are, I can tell you, we are fully, the Secretariat and the board members, we are fully absorbed by the task, which is basically a part-time job, but it is very time-consuming, and we are very reluctant to basically shoulder more responsibilities.
Thank you, and I hope we have time for one last question. Next person is Barry McMullen.
Thanks very much, Barry McMullen from Dublin City University in Ireland. I won't spend time thanking you all. It's great work. Very brief question, Professor Edenhofer, if you could comment, say anything at all about the underlying macroeconomic characteristics of the scenarios. In particular, what happens to aggregate economic activity in the EU under these scenarios? Is it the same across all the scenarios? Does it increase in all of them, or any of them in which aggregate economic activity declines? Can you just elaborate a bit on that? Thank you very much.
Yes, I can elaborate a bit on this. So basically what we evaluated are two fundamental macroeconomic indicators. The one are the macroeconomic mitigation costs, which basically is the amount of consumption and or GDP losses when this transformation pathways are, or this emission reduction requirements are imposed on the economy. We all know that the mitigation costs is an incomplete measure, because at the same time you have then to take into account also the benefits from these activities, and the benefits are not only the avoided climate damages, but also some co-benefits regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. Nevertheless, we reported in the report the macroeconomic costs, being aware of the incompleteness, and so to say, they are, as most of the IPCC scenarios, in the range between 1% to 3% GDP losses. This is just a postponement of economic growth. This is not very large, but still we lack that we have no information in the scenarios about the distribution of this mitigation costs. So what kind of groups are over proportional impacted by that. And also what we did, we highlighted, so to say, the investment expenditures, because we felt that macroeconomic costs alone are not informative enough, and therefore we reported also when available the investment. So this is what we have done. And one aspect which is not in the report, but this should be highlighted. So the macroeconomic scenarios report also very different carbon prices. Some of them basically have high carbon prices, others have lower carbon prices, but this has a lot to do to what extent low-hanging fruits are available or not. And therefore, even high carbon prices are consistent with very moderate macroeconomic costs. So I think that's a little bit what I can answer to that. But you can find the numbers and the indicators in the report. And we also provide here a range, not just a point estimation.
Okay, I think thank you very much to all participants, and thanks again to Professor Edenhofer for this exchange. I would like again to thank you for participating in this webinar and for all the good questions. I can see that time ran very short, very quickly, and there were some questions now starting to appear on the chat. What I would like to suggest is, if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to get in touch with the Secretariat. Our contact information can be found on the advisory board website, that and the link will appear on the chat right away. Thank you.